The Holy Gospel according to John, the first chapter.
Glory to you, O Lord.
In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him, and without him not one thing came into being. What has come into being in him was life, and the life was the light of all people. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it. There was a man sent from God whose name was John. He came as a witness to testify to the light, so that all might believe through him. He himself was not the light, but he came to testify to the light. The true light, which enlightens everyone, was coming into the world. He was not in the world, he was in the world, and the world came into being through him. Yet the world did not know him. He came to what was his own, and his own people did not accept him. But to all who received him, who believed in his name, he gave power to become children of God, who were born not of blood or of the will of the flesh or of the will of man, but of God. And the Word became flesh and lived among us. And we have seen his glory, the glory as of a Father's only Son, full of grace and truth. John testified to him and cried out, "This was he of whom I said, 'He who comes after me ranks ahead of me, because he was before me.' From his fullness we have all received grace upon grace. The law indeed was given through Moses. Grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. No one has ever seen God. It is God, the only Son, who is close to the Father's heart, who has made him known." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, O Christ.
So how many of you knew that you can go on an official walking tour of Cole Camp? No, not many. I mean, you of course can go on a walk around town anytime you like, but some time ago, I don't remember when it was or where I found it, I came across this brochure. And it will take you on this guided walk around town with 41 different destinations where you can stop and read a brief blurb about that location or that building right here in this pamphlet. And it's been interesting and really helpful for someone like me who's still relatively new here, especially when you refer to a place that it's never been called in 80 years. Yeah, where the library used to be. Well, this was done by the Cole Camp Betterment Association, and like I said, it gives all kinds of history of what has been at each location. For example, where the toy store is now, it says, "A butcher shop was the first business to be housed in the building in 1899. Anyone remember that? Wow, you're old. It later became a produce house, and since the 1940s has been a restaurant, hobby shop, and a woodcarver's shop. I mean, so many places or so many things in one place. And nearly every location in this pamphlet is the same way. Owners and businesses and needs and purposes of each of these locations change over time. I'm sure most of this is probably old news for many of you, but for newcomers and visitors, this gives a great insight into the changes of the town and all the different roles that the buildings have played throughout history. John's house would not, however, fit that kind of mold. So as I said, we've, in a sense, been doing our own kind of walking tour as we've visited the homes of each of the gospel writers during this Advent season. Our pamphlet for the tour has been the Bible, primarily the Gospels, but also some Old Testament. And more than just the history of the home or the location, we've been looking around the house to see what each writer wants to reveal about the birth of Jesus. Sometimes it's not a whole lot. We heard at Mark's house that we heard nothing about the birth of Jesus. We only heard about his baptism and his journey into the wilderness. Matthew and Luke got a little bit more into the festive Christmas mood as they invited everyone over to celebrate the birth of a baby and had decorations everywhere. But even the two of them couldn't agree on the details, and they took different roads to convey what they felt needed to stand out about the birth of God's Son. So, last but not least, today we go to John's house. And it's a bit of a trek to get there, actually, so we probably don't even want to walk. It's down a few gravel roads, you know about those. It's kind of out in the middle of nowhere. And if you go at night, it's one of those trips where even your high beams don't seem to light it up enough to let you see where you're going. But just about that time when you think you're totally lost and feel like you should just turn around, kind of out of nowhere, you start seeing a glimpse of light. And as you get closer, those lights just get brighter. And you start wondering if John just lives in a glass house because there's light pouring out of every single window imaginable. There's not a ton of Christmas decorations in or around the house, at least not many that you would notice during the daytime. But at night, those decorations light up. And it's just simple light to let you know that something is there. And unlike this walking tour of Cole Camp, John's house has always been John's house. I mean, think about it. We heard it read just a little bit ago. How does the gospel begin? What are the first words? In the beginning. This is interactive. In the beginning, which of course sounds a whole lot like Genesis. Genesis, in the beginning when God created the heavens and the earth. John, in the beginning was the Word. And it's not just a coincidence that John begins this way. John's faithful hearers are going to instantly know that in John's worldview, the good news of Jesus Christ really starts at the beginning of everything. With those first few words from John, we are transported back to the moment of creation, knowing that that point is also the beginning of the story of redemption. We have life, redemption, wholeness. It's all been there since the beginning of time. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. It feels so simple, though. Too simple, almost. I mean, really, for as convoluted and as confusing as John's gospel tends to be most of the time when we read it in English, John really does use plain and simple Greek when he writes this gospel. I'm sure most of you know that I was a youth director before I went to seminary. And so at that church where I was working, when I had decided and announced that I was going to seminary, a gentleman came up to me and he offered to start teaching me Greek so I could have a head start as I went into seminary. Yeah, fun, right? Really made me want to keep going to seminary. But, I mean, this was a guy who was always at the church. He was always a greeter at the door. And as he sat there, he would, kill time by reading the Bible in Greek. And so he invited me, and I took him up on the offer. And we had those first few lessons that I slept through. Paid thorough attention to. And when we had those lessons, we began in John's gospel. And I thought that was nuts. But apparently, as I found out, that gospel is the plainest to read when it comes to the Greek. In the beginning was the Word. John focuses on words, which is important. Remember how we said he connects us back to the beginning at Genesis? Do you remember what God's first words are in the creation story? what is the first thing that God says recorded in the Bible? Let there be light. So what does John go on to focus on next? The Word was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him, and without him not one thing came into being. What has come into being in him was life, and the life was the light of all people. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it. Yet another word that's important to John at the start of his gospel: light. A light that can banish the darkness. A light that darkness can't even comprehend. A light that cannot be extinguished. A light that has come to us from God, through whom we have come into being, who is the Word, who has existed since the beginning of time. This is why John's gospel gives me a headache. But it's also why John's gospel gives me so much hope. I've been using this particular passage a lot recently at funerals, especially at funerals around Christmas time, because this is John's Christmas story. And it is John conveying God's promise that in our dark days, when we are surrounded by the darkness of grief and sorrow, surrounded by tragedy and death, God, the light, will overcome all of that. God, the light, brings about life. Isn't that what we need to hear? That we get through life through God? A couple weeks ago, I ran into a friend as I was working at a coffee shop, and of course we began the usual way. How you doing? Her response to me, though, was, well, I'm surviving. I really wish I was thriving, though. Isn't that what God wants from us, to thrive and not just survive? I should really strive for that, don't you think? That was a way more honest response than the usual, fine. But isn't she right? Why do we keep settling for just getting by? Why can't we actually get to the point in our life of actually thriving through God? Oh yeah, but then we start looking around at everything that's going on around us, with tragedies and sickness, and brokenness and pain, division and fighting and death and. But then we look up and remember John's house. We remember how the light comes seemingly out of nowhere when we're lost in the dark and searching for it. We remember that this life brings with it life, not just surviving life, but thriving life, and the promise of new life. And we remember that this light, this life, this Word, this God, has been with us from the very beginning of time and will be with us until the very end of time. And through that, we know that we are not alone. We know that God is right here, right now, always and forever. Amen.